Now, the next closing statement is going to be made by Mr. Ageros on behalf of the Tenant Management Organisation, and I understand that he wishes to make his statement remotely. So I think we wait for a moment to see whether he's going to come up on the screen.
Sorry for this. It was working until a very short moment ago, and it's now started to play up. Can I ask whether you can hear me?
No.
If that's Mr. Ageros speaking in the background, the answer is no, only some disembodied voice, and we can't see you either. So I think the better course would be for us to rise for a moment.
Yes, thank you.
We can now hear you, but we can't see you, and I'm sure everyone would like to see you as well as hear you. So
yes.
We'll rise.
I'm very sorry. Will you just give me 5 minutes? I'm really sorry about this.
Don't worry. We'll rise for a couple of minutes, and we'll ask the usher to come and get us when you are there, visible as well as audible. All right?
Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, the panel is back again. Mr. Ageros, we can now see you, I'm very glad to say. And can you hear me?
I can.
Thank
you very much, sir.
And we can hear you. So
great. I do apologise for that. I'm afraid to say it happened literally just as we were about to start.
Don't worry. These things are easily done, and it's all been rectified now. Yeah.
So can I say thank you first for allowing me to attend remotely from Birmingham, where I'm conducting a case. Unfortunately, I was in court this morning. Otherwise, I would have been there in person to deliver these submissions to you in person. I'm sorry for not being there in person.
So can I just interrupt? There's no visual of Mr. Ageros.
Could you just pause a minute, Mr. Ageros? I'm sorry, you've got no.
There's no visual of Mr. Ageros on the screen.
Oh, well, no, Mr. Ageros, I don't know whether you heard that. Ms. Studd has just risen to tell me that you're not appearing on the screens that the public can see. And I think the public should be able to see you. So I'm going to ask the usher's just gone to speak to the technical people.
So can I ask, can you see me? I'm just checking whether it's my end or not.
No, it's not your end, as far as I can tell, because we can
I
see
see.
you and we can hear you. And apparently you appear on some of the screens in the room. Ms. Studd, if you're very keen to see Mr. Ageros,
No, I can see him, but I know that the brief about the residents. Oh, now they can. It's just come on.
yes? Right. I think we've solved that problem as well. Well, I haven't, but somebody has, that's the point. So I think
I'll carry on, sir, shall I?
we can ask you to carry on, and let's assume everything's all right.
Thank you very much. Well, so in making these final overarching submissions, the TMO appreciates that it will not be helpful to repeat submissions made previously or rehearse evidence heard before the inquiry in detail. And so therefore, I will avoid doing this as far as possible here. However, in identifying some of the themes the TMO considers to be key, it will be necessary to go back over some of the ground previously covered. As it has throughout, the TMO expresses its sincere sympathy and condolences to those who lost loved ones during the terrible fire which occurred on 14th of June 2017. And it hopes that those who grieve may find some comfort in the years to come, including through the findings of this public inquiry. So as to the TMO's interaction with the inquiry generally, although by March 2018, the TMO ceased to exist as a body with day-to-day responsibility for the management of Grenfell Tower, it has, through its lawyers and remaining staff, none of whom were in post before and at the time of the fire, sought to assist the inquiry in achieving its aims, including through the disclosure of thousands of documents and the provision of hundreds of witness statements, including ones from witnesses who gave evidence before the inquiry. So TMO witnesses gave evidence in modules 1, 3 and 4. Some gave evidence on multiple occasions and across a number of days and were the subject of detailed questioning. Many others gave statements but were not called to give evidence in person. So the inquiry will form its own view about each of the TMO witnesses, but it is submitted that all witnesses who gave oral evidence certainly did their best to engage and support the inquiry's process. Counsel for the inquiry urged core participants not to engage in a merry-go-round of buck passing, and it was remarked on that none of the core participants, save for RBKC, and now possibly DLHC and the BBA, has made any admissions before the inquiry. This is not lost on the TMO. However, as the inquiry knows, the TMO exists now only as an organisation whose function is to respond to any civil or criminal proceedings brought against it. The handful of staff presently in post were not in post before the fire and had no dealings with the refurbishment. So for these reasons, it is not appropriate for those now employed to express critical judgments about the organisation as it previously was or its employees. This is especially so when a number of the individuals in question continue to be investigated by the police for serious criminal offences. So, however, the TMO understands that being the client for the project and the resident-facing body for the refurbishment, the inquiry will look carefully at the TMO's role. This is only right and to be expected. So at the end of all the evidence, it's worth reflecting again on why the Grenfell Tower refurbishment occurred in the first place. The intentions behind the refurbishment project were good ones. The overriding intention was to improve the quality of residents' lives by investing heavily in the building, including in its energy efficiency. So we say that it's important to keep this in mind when assessing the actions and motivation of TMO staff, as all their efforts were geared towards the improvement of residents' living conditions. How the inquiry views the TMO witnesses is ultimately a matter for the inquiry, but it is submitted that it would be entitled to conclude that all were well-intentioned social housing professionals and unacted with ill will or a reckless attitude towards residents' health and safety. So it's been suggested that the TMO, among other core participants, may have been an institutionally racist organisation, certainly according to the Macpherson definition. This is emphatically not accepted by the TMO, nor indeed was accepted by any of the witnesses that gave evidence at the inquiry. In fact, sir, no witness was questioned on the topic, and the TMO submits that it would be unfair in those circumstances to make such a finding without an evidential basis. The inquiry will also determine whether the TMO and RBKC were, as it has been put, only interested in improving the look of Grenfell Tower and whether this suggestion was likely. While the finish of the building was certainly important, it is submitted that aesthetics were certainly not the final driver in the refurbishment. In identifying the priorities for the refurbishment project, the TMO engaged with the community and its residents. These discussions revealed that improvements to the internal living conditions could best be achieved by upgrading the communal domestic hot water and central heating systems, and by installing thermal insulation to improve thermal efficiency and fuel economy, as well as by installing new windows. While the TMO certainly sought to include residents in the decision-making processes about the refurbishment, and the ways in which it did this were extensively considered in Module 3, the TMO acknowledges that some residents say they did not participate meaningfully in the discussions surrounding the refurbishment, and it acknowledges that the inquiry will consider how else the TMO could and should have achieved meaningful engagement. So one example of the TMO listening to and responding to residents' concern is when dissatisfaction was expressed during the project about the positioning of the hot water boiler. The TMO took these concerns into consideration and adjusted the plan alongside Ryden, albeit after some delay. Some general submissions. The Grenfell Tower fire was a fire unprecedented in post-war mainland UK history, and the causes of it have been shown to be complex, deep-rooted, and deeply troubling. Although the fire occurred at Grenfell Tower, it is submitted that in reality, the same or a similar fire could have occurred at any of the many high-rise buildings across the UK that were clad in ACMs or other combustible cladding, or which had PIR or other combustible insulation. This was the view of a number of informed commentators from within the social housing sector in the wake of the fire. For example, David Montague, then the chief executive at L&Q, said of the tragedy, and so this is a quote, "It's utterly shocking, the thought that it could have been anybody in the sector. So we submit that such views should not be readily discounted. It may be that a fire of the sheer scale and lethal intensity of the one at Grenfell Tower was always liable to be unique, although this may ultimately be a matter of speculation. And it is recognised that other cladding fires have not resulted in such a terrible loss of life. And so the inquiry will certainly consider whether there were peculiarities at Grenfell Tower which allowed the fire to spread as quickly and extensively as it did. For example, the presence of the architectural crown, which is strongly implicated in the fire's horizontal spread across the building, and the fire then burning down other sides of the building. Whatever is the case with this, Urgent investigations following the fire revealed the extent and complexity of what's been referred to in common parlance as the cladding crisis. There was flammable cladding on large numbers of buildings, high-rise and low-rise, private and public sector. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, dangerous cladding was removed from hundreds of buildings, and where it could not be removed immediately, waking watches were established and indeed are still in place on many buildings, even to this day. The TMO submits that the inquiry should carefully consider the extent of the wider problem. It is submitted that only by doing this can the inquiry make a properly informed judgment of the TMO as client in this refurbishment project. So the inquiry has not closely considered the extent to which ACMs and other flammable materials were present on other blocks across the UK at the time of the fire. And therefore, the submissions I make on this matter today are derived mainly from open public sources. And so within the written submissions, we have provided links and footnotes in respect of these sources. Soon after the fire, tests were carried out on numerous blocks, and the government announced that every tower block tested had failed some fire safety tests in respect of its cladding. In October 2017, up to 60 tower blocks across 25 local authorities, a large proportion of which were council-owned or housing association, were reported to have failed such tests. A review of records for March 2018, provided by MHCLG and collated as part of the Building Safety Programme, indicated there were at that time 306 buildings over 18 metres with ACM cladding which did not meet building regulations and presented fire hazards. Online figures for 2019 and 2020 showed a steady increase in the number of buildings over 18 metres that had ACM which did not meet building regulations. On a final tally, as of 30th September 2022, the government published figures state that there were a total of 486 residential properties over 18 metres with ACM cladding systems unlikely to meet building regulations. The MHCLG commissioned testing into the burning behaviours of a range of non-ACM cladding materials to identify whether there were other types of cladding that burned like the materials present on Grenfell Tower. Many buildings were found to have this type of cladding, and therefore in March 2020, the DLHC announced a £1 billion building safety fund aimed at remediating buildings of 18 metres and above, which presented a significant risk of fire. As of 30th of September 2022, there have been 2,824 private sector applications for government funds from the Building Safety Fund to fix buildings with non-ACM problems. So we say this is indicative of the national crisis which has been revealed since the fire. So we have not sought to collate figures for buildings internationally, but it's well known that this is also an international problem. In addition, the fact that 49 developers, which includes numerous well-established companies such as Barratt, Bellway, Barclay, Crest Nicholson, Galliard Homes, Persimmon and Taylor Wimpey, to name only a few, signed the Building Safety Repairs Pledge to remediate life-critical fire safety works in buildings over 11 metres, which they themselves had played a role in developing or refurbishing across the last 30 years in England. This also attests to the scale of the problem. So we say that these figures cannot be ignored when the inquiry assesses the circumstances in which a block managed by the TMO came to be clad in such dangerous materials. The sheer scale of the cladding crisis supports the proposition that it could have been anybody in the sector, and whether in the light of this it would be wrong to single out the TMO or its employees as being uniquely or egregiously at fault. For each building where there was dangerous cladding that needed to be removed, there would have been a CDM client likely in a similar position to the TMO. So moving on now to some general submissions about the materials used in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower. And as you reported in the phase 1 report, the principal reason why Grenfell Tower was so quickly and completely engulfed by fire was because it was clad in an ACM with a polyethylene core. Without the ready source of fuel provided by the ACMs, it seems highly unlikely that there would have been a fire of such lethal intensity. Once the fire took hold in the ACM cladding and compartmentation was breached, all active and passive fire measures were quickly overwhelmed as they were being called on to perform in an unprecedented situation for which they were never designed. So the evidence touching on these issues has been painstakingly examined during the inquiry, but as the TMO submits that its responsibility for the circumstance in which these ACMs came to be used is extremely limited, it proposes to summarise briefly some of the salient features of that history now. So the Renault 55 PE rain screen panel cassette system was tested in France in 2005. It received a Class E rating under the standard European fire test system, where A1 was the best and F the worst. It was only in a 2008 report that the Renault PE 55 received a Euro Class B rating, and this was for the riveted form and not the cassette form. This one successful European test in 2008 was quickly used to obtain UK certification from the BBA. The certificate in question stated that the Renault PE 55 panels were to be regarded as having a Class 0 surface, and it is submitted, gave the reader of the certificate to think that this included the cassette form also. Sir Arconic was happy to rely on the BBA certificate and did so for the next 8 years, despite the fact that it knew the cassette form of the product had been rated only Class E in 2005, and indeed when retested in 2011, 2014 and 2015, it received the same E classification. Indeed, it seems that after 2011, when Arconic became definitively aware of Renault PE's poor performance in fire, it deliberately targeted countries such as the UK, which were not solely working with the European classification system. Certification aside, Arconic was aware of the inherent risks with this cladding from 2007 onwards. The inquiry heard that Arconic's marketing manager attended a presentation in 2007 which warned of ACM cladding fires, but despite this, Arconic continued to manufacture and market Renault PE, telling clients, such as the TMO, it was able to follow what type of product was being developed and offer the right specification. Thus, when in 2012 and 2013 Arconic pushed PE 55 in cassette form for use on Grenfell Tower, and so they did push it, knowing this was a high-rise building, they were aware that it was wrongly certificated and its use had been implicated in serious fires. Dealing briefly with the insulation used on Grenfell Tower, the TMO makes these brief submissions. Although unsafe cladding was the principal cause of the fire, the expert evidence has shown that unsafe insulation, including Celotex's RS 5000 and Kingspan's Cooltherm K15 insulation boards, increased the likelihood of a serious fire and the intensity of any fire once it started. The inquiry heard evidence that 2014 testing of Celotex RS 5000 was rigged. Also, that the BRE, which conducted the test, may or may not have been aware of this. Celotex then marketed the product in a way it accepted in evidence was thoroughly misleading. With Kingspan K15, there was a similar story. The Kingspan product used in the refurbishment had failed a fire test in 2007, but nevertheless, Kingspan marketed it on the basis of a successful test in 2005. However, this test related to a product with a different makeup and composition. Witnesses from Kingspan appeared to accept in evidence that this amounted to deliberately misleading the customer. With the above in mind, with this in mind, sir, it's again alarming that a certificate was then issued by the BBA in 2008, which classified K15 as class 0, with the certificate further stating that the product will not contribute to the development stages of a fire or present a smoke or toxic hazard. K15 was neither non-combustible nor a material of limited combustibility. It seems that even after the fire, and indeed the inquiry's initial findings about the role of the installation, it was still necessary for the Secretary of State to serve prohibition notices on Kingspan, requiring it to cease supplying the product and to contact its customers and those in the supply chain to secure its return from the market and use. Very simply, sir, had the TMO known or been made aware by its professional team that the certification for any of the products used in the refurbishment was inaccurate, or that the testing of those products was invalid, it would certainly not have allowed them to be used. The TMO will no doubt consider the extent to which it was let down by its own team of professional advisors. So findings after the fire about the prevalence of these products in other buildings is alarming. They're, in the light of the mis-selling and mis-testing, possibly unsurprising. So the story of how dangerous products came to be used on Grenfell Towers does not end with their certification by the BBA. It's necessary also to consider misconceptions and willful misuse of the UK Class 0 rating. The UK Class 0 rating was widely understood to mean, principally on the basis of diagram 40 in ADB, that a product was suitable without more for use on the outside of buildings taller than 18 metres. Although the prevalent view, this was not what Class 0 meant or should have meant. In fact, it had nothing to do with the overall combustibility of a given material, including the combustibility of the core of a composite such as ACM. How was it that this dangerous misconception, under which much of the construction industry was labouring, arose and persisted? It seems that government certainly played a part in it. The evidence the inquiry heard in Module 6 suggests that government was aware that the Class 0 classification was being continuously and consistently misrepresented. Barbara Lane said it had degraded over time. David Crowder from the BBA said that he did not support Class 0 as a fire safety test, but it was maintained due to political motivations. When he shared his concerns with Brian Masters, he was told that there were, and I quote, Brian Martin, he was told that there were, and I quote, industry interests and products that were on the market as a result of achieving Class 0 that would cease to be on the market if Class 0 ceased to be a viable option. That this state of affairs arose and persisted in England and Wales in plain view of the government was all the more surprising because in 2005, after the Garnock Court fire in 1999, Scotland changed its technical guidance to require cladding used on external walls of high-rise domestic buildings to be constructed on non-combustible products. There was no ambiguity with this. Despite the fact that the Parliamentary Select Committee said, and again I quote, "We do not believe that it should take a serious fire in which many people are killed before reasonable steps are taken towards minimising the risks. And although effective changes were made in Scotland, only limited changes were made to ADB, and the government did not change the guidance in ADB that Class 0 materials could be used on the external walls of a high-rise building. Moreover, the 2009 Lakanal Rule 43 recommendations, which set out a clear case for revisiting regulation on cladding on exterior walls, including ADB, were well known to all, but were not acted upon." So it was right, therefore, that DLUHC said in its opening statement to the inquiry in Phase 2, Module 6, that, and I quote again, "the department should have done more to take on board the learning and recommendations triggered by other fires, including the tragic events at Lakanal House, including exploring whether the system was working as intended. Similarly, correspondence from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fire Safety should have been addressed in a timelier manner, with more done to probe the issues raised by them." So it was also right, therefore, for counsel for DLUHC to admit in closing submissions to Module 6 that it, DLUHC, failed to provide sufficient oversight of a regulatory system which, if it had been in place, could have prevented the Grenfell Tower fire. It was also accepted that deregulation played a part in underpinning a culture in which officials did not properly escalate warnings when they were raised, or progress work in response to recommendations, and in particular those made by the coroner following the Lakanal House fire in 2009. And so the TMO says the inquiry will have to make a decision on whether the government actually colluded in the dangerously misleading system of selling and classification for this type of material. So as an aside, whether in fact it fell to the government to stay ahead of changing practice within the construction industry has been questioned by many, including Dame Judith Hackett in her independent review of building regulations. However, whatever the answer to that is, the guidance produced by the government was unclear and was widely interpreted to justify the use of certain combustible products in circumstances where they were wholly unsuitable. So we, on behalf of the TMO, have spent some time addressing the mis-selling and misclassification of ACMs and insulation, and failures by HMM government to get a grip of the regulatory system, because it is submitted that this is an important backdrop for consideration of, in particular, the way the TMO acted in the contractual procurement process and management of the projects. So as was previously submitted, the TMO will say that the way that it went about appointing contractors in the pre and post-contract phase for the refurbishment was rational and generally acceptable for a non-specialist client receiving advice on appointments in a design and build contract. So the inquiry is well aware of the history of the TMO, but briefly, it was a not-for-profit company incorporated in 1995 under the right to manage legislation, whose function was to manage and maintain RBKC's housing stock. It had no shareholders, but did have approximately 5,600 members who were residents of RBKC housing stock. It was a resident-led organisation in that there was a majority of local tenants and leaseholders on its boards. Any profit or surpluses were retained by the organisation to improve services to residents. It was the client for the refurbishment project pursuant to the CDM regulations 2007. And so these regulations acknowledge that clients may not themselves be specialists in construction techniques, and so are not required to plan or manage the projects themselves. While, sir, as you observed, it was an educated client, its key function was nevertheless the management and maintenance of social housing stock where RBKC was landlord. In 2011, RBKC had advertised through the OJU process the tender for a project to build a new academy and leisure centre, Calc, on the Lancaster West estate at the base of Grenfell Tower. The Calc project also included the construction of 30 residential dwellings. This project was authorised and led by RBKC, with the TMO playing no role. However, because RBKC recognised that the residents of Grenfell Tower were directly affected by the ongoing works on Calc, and because the TMO was able to identify Grenfell Tower as a major investment priority, there were discussions about whether it could be regenerated alongside the Calc project. For the Calc project, RBKC had procured a team of professional consultants by accessing a competitive tender and vetting process. The project team included Studio E's lead consultant, Appleyard's Artelia, as cost consultants, and employer's agent Max Fordham as structural employer's agent, Max Fordham as structural engineers, and Ledbetter Group as the principal contractor. The decision was taken to utilise the same team, or broadly the same, not least because Calc, which was on a far greater scale than the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, was deemed to be a successful project. The intended benefit of using the same consultants and contractors was that the works could commence more expeditiously and be more cost efficient. The TMO understood that all the appointees for the Calc project would be qualified and competent to carry out the refurbishment project at Grenfell Tower. It was certainly not told otherwise. In recognition of the scale of the project, the TMO established its own project management team to oversee the refurbishment from the client's perspective. This team included a dedicated project manager. While the team possessed a general understanding of the construction industry and its legislative framework and of how projects were procured and delivered from the viewpoint of a client, it would only ever have delivered a construction project by employing external construction professionals. The TMO would not and could not deliver any construction projects itself. Artelia, which was appointed as employer's agent, advised that the procurement route for the project should be design and build. A pre-contract professional team whose responsibility was to ensure that all pre-contract works were compliant with applicable legislation, codes of practice, and building control requirements was assembled. The TMO as client was not part of the PCPT and relied on the professional team it had appointed for design compliance. Studio E was a key part of the PCPT and was engaged to provide a complete service of works from inception to completion. It was appointed to provide full architectural services and was lead consultant, lead designer, and architect as designer. At the pre-contract stage, Studio E was responsible for compiling the design and specification for the works, which included the windows and the cladding systems. So the TMO recognised that concern has been expressed that Studio E had never previously undertaken the overcladding of a residential building, and it is accepted that the inquiry will accept this aspect of the evidence with care. So we say that the evidence of Paul Hyatt is relevant on the point. He said it was not unreasonable for a practice of the size and experience of Studio E to undertake such a project, as long as it took appropriate steps to acquire the knowledge to discharge the project safely. Ryden was appointed as principal contractor following its successful tender, and so it's submitted that Ryden too was a rational and suitable appointment at the time, given its size, its track record, and its familiarity with cladding projects. Pursuant to the design and build contract, Ryden was required to carry out the design, construction, and completion of both the proposed recladding and installation of windows. The contract with Ryden specified that the construction and materials used in it complied with all applicable regulations, legislation, and codes of practice. So, turning to two particular topics of concern about the pre- and post-contract procurement phase, these particularly arose in the evidence heard in Module 1. They'll be addressed again briefly here. Firstly, what's been described in the inquiry as Peter Madison's offline meeting with Ryden. The TMO submits that whatever the inquiry may conclude about the circumstances in which the meeting occurred, even if matters had been approached differently, it is unlikely that a different contract would have been appointed, as by the time the meeting occurred, Ryden had been identified as the preferred bidder through price and quality. Moreover, even if a different contractor had been appointed, it's highly unlikely that different decisions would have been taken about the materials. Value engineering. The inquiry heard that there was value engineering between the TMO and Ryden prior to Ryden being appointed as principal contractor in March 2014. While it is acknowledged that Ryden was the only tendering contractor offered the opportunity to value engineer, this does not mean that the value engineering was wrong per se. In fact, sir, it was common for value engineering to occur in large-scale construction projects of this sort, especially ones involving public money. And of course, an organisation such as the TMO had a duty to use public money efficiently. It is recognised that the choice of cladding formed part of the value engineering process. And in this context, the TMO invites the inquiry to consider that the prospect of using cladding other than zinc had already been raised in 2013 by another contractor, Leadbitter, and this was prior to Peter Madison joining the project. In fact, as part of the original MBS specification, bidders had been asked to price for alternative rain screen cladding to zinc. Therefore, the possibility that cladding other than zinc would be used had arisen before the value engineering process was undertaken. Moreover, Simon Lawrence from Ryden was arguing in favour of using ACMs before the value engineering exercise had been embarked upon. So too, apparently, was Mark Harris of Harley Facades in the meeting on the 27th of September 2013 at the Hayes Galleria with Studio E. In the light of this, the TMO submits the inquiry should ask itself whether, even if value engineering had not occurred, a different outcome with regard to cladding would have been reached. So two further issues. The client heard that the inquiry heard evidence on whether the TMO should have appointed a client design advisor, whether it was appropriate for the TMO to take on the role itself. The TMO reiterates its closing submissions to modules 1 and 2, where it was said that the CDM regulations did not require a client design advisor to be appointed. And even if one had been appointed, it is highly unlikely, it is submitted, that this would have made a difference to the selection of materials, the wider design process, or the quality of workmanship, especially in the light of what the inquiry heard about the mis-selling and misregulations surrounding ACMs. Another issue is whether, when the CDM regulations 2015 came in, the TMO should have assumed the newly created role of principal designer. So this was also addressed in the TMO's closing submissions to modules 1 and 2. And as was stated there, the TMO was not advised until late in the day that the new legislation required a principal designer to be appointed, and it only took on the role when all others refused it. In any event, by the time Claire Williams took on the role, she was advised that the design was fundamentally complete. And so, even if the inquiry does conclude that the TMO should not have assumed the role, there is little to suggest that by doing so it caused events to occur which would not otherwise have occurred, or fail to prevent events which should not have occurred. So more generally, whatever input the TMO had into the choice of materials used on Grenfell Tower, at no point was it ever told by its experienced professional team that the materials finally selected for use were inappropriate, still less dangerous. In the light of all the inquiries heard about the tangled web of cynical corporate deception, long-standing and deep-rooted misconceptions about the key classification for cladding products used on tower blocks above 18 metres, and a regulatory framework that allowed such dangerous misconceptions to persist, it is submitted that it would be unfair for the inquiry to conclude that the TMO should in some way unilaterally have realised that ACMs were inappropriate for use during the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. This is something it submitted the inquiry should bear in mind when looking at Claire Williams' Lacanau moment. When considering whether this was a missed opportunity to use cladding other than flammable ACMs, the inquiry should recognise that the decision to use them was reached, approved of, or acquiesced in by a number of contractors, all of whom either had or purported to have expertise in the selection of materials. So two more discrete matters before I come to my last topic, the role of Exover first. There is strong evidence to show that Exover did not complete important fire safety work on the refurbishment, and in doing so failed in its contractual responsibilities. Exover is maintaining that it was not retained by RIDE and does little to explain why it failed to complete the work it should have completed, which would have included an assessment of the external wall and to advise properly on the smoke control system. The project was also signed off by RBKC Building Control as being compliant with the prevailing building standards. Whether or not this should have happened is a matter the inquiry will examine with care, including whether there was an over-reliance on building control and whether the workload of John Hoban was too onerous. However, whatever the inquiry concludes in relation to this, it's respectfully submitted the TMO is entitled to derive comfort and assurance from building control sign-off and approval, certainly against the backdrop of a project which had been carried out by professionals, including those in the cladding industry. There was nothing following that approval to put the TMO on notice that things had been done in an unsafe or dangerous way. So turning now to the last topic in which the TMO will make submissions, the way in which the active and passive fire measures at Grenfell Tower performed on the night, including the way in which the TMO procured and managed the contract for these, also the appointment and retention of Carl Stokes and Pepys. The TMO reiterates the general submission it has made previously, that the active and passive fire measures were never designed to operate in a fire of this magnitude and so were quickly overwhelmed. It submitted the inquiry will have to grapple with the issues of causation that arise from this fact. Regarding the build-up of smoke in the communal lobbies, the TMO acknowledges that the inquiry has heard evidence that the build-up of smoke in the communal lobbies was rapid and represented a key factor in the ability of residents to escape. It is accepted the inquiry has heard evidence suggesting that this rapid build-up may have been connected with the resistance of some of the fire doors in place and the absence of self-closing devices on some of the flat front doors. Regarding the first of these, the inquiry heard evidence in Module 3 that the TMO entered into a contract with Mance Master Door to replace doors across the housing stock it managed. It appears that Mance likely did not fit doors that had the necessary resistance to fire in the way it had been contracted to do. The inquiry will have to assess the circumstances surrounding the discharge of the contract. TMO made detailed submissions on this in its closing to Module 3, and they will certainly not be repeated here. So looking at the topic from a wider perspective, there is evidence to suggest that fire doors with inadequate levels of fire resistance was a widespread problem in the industry, was certainly not merely confined to the TMO or Grenfell Tower. Testing carried out by the government in 2018 showed that fire doors made by 5 different suppliers failed fire safety tests and were withdrawn from the market. The then Community Secretary, James Brokenshire, confirmed at the time that he had, and I quote, enough evidence to suggest that there is a broader issue across the fire door market. In March 2018, the government told Parliament that there was no evidence of a systemic issue with fire doors. However, following that, Mance Master Door removed 2 types of doors from sale as they did not meet the standard when tested, and it is reported to have contacted social housing landlords who are customers to inform them of the issue. In July 2018, MHCLG wrote to building control bodies, alerting them to the need to check the performance of fire doors to ensure the requirements of building regulations were met. By November 2018, government was undertaking an investigation into the fire door industry following concerns about the consistency of flat front entrance fire doors against the required performance standard. So concerning the way in which the TMO sought to ensure that door closers, once fitted, were kept in good repair, the inquiry heard detailed evidence on this, including how the TMO was told after the Adair Tower fire that it should take steps to satisfy itself that door closers across its estate were functioning correctly. The TMO accepts the inquiry will look carefully at how it sought to implement the requirements of the deficiency notice issued in respect of the Adair Tower and how it dealt with the issue of door closers prior to this. Detailed submissions on this topic were made in the TMO's closing submissions to Module 3, and again, they will not be repeated here. Suffice it to say that ensuring door closers were fitted and kept in a good condition was an issue affecting the whole social housing industry. Janice Ray said that when she made inquiries of others within the social housing sector, none really had a solution of ready or widespread application. That there was a widespread problem with the maintenance of door closers is apparent from what was said by the Door and Hardware Federation, a trade association for companies associated with locks and buildings, hardware and door sets. DHF's general manager and secretary stated that it is too often the case that door closers are incorrectly specified or badly installed, and a greater understanding of how to comply with the relevant standards was needed. He also said that a lack of maintenance often exacerbates the problem. The difficulties in drafting definitive advice for those involved in building safety is illustrated by, for example, the fact in January 2020, the government published building safety advice for building owners, including advice on fire doors, but the publication was withdrawn on the 10th of January 2022 because it was said to have been wrongly interpreted and to have driven a too cautious approach to building safety, going beyond what the government considered necessary. The Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 will make it a legal requirement from the 23rd of January 2023 for responsible persons for all multi-occupied residential buildings in England with stories over 11 metres high to 1, undertake quarterly checks of all fire doors, including self-closing devices in the common parts, and 2, undertake on a best endeavour basis annual checks of all flat entrance doors, including self-closing device that lead onto a building's common parts. The regulations will also require responsible persons to provide residents of all multi-occupied residential buildings with information on the importance of fire doors to a building's fire safety. So it's a matter for the inquiry, but it's submitted that the fact that such legislation was enacted attests to an existing lack of clarity around when and how door closers should be checked, and the need to make sure that the general public appreciate their importance. The fact that duty holders are required only to use best endeavours to check flat entrance doors speaks to the difficulties in gaining access to domestic flats. So touching briefly on the lifts at Grenfell Tower, when the lifts were refurbished, the TMO received expert advice on how to ensure it met the relevant standards, and the inquiry will consider the extent of the advice given and whether the TMO reasonably relied on the advice. Further, after the refurbishment, there were contracts in place for maintenance of the lifts, and the TMO's expectations that the lifts were being properly maintained. The inquiry will consider the way in which the TMO managed these contracts. The inquiry will also draw conclusions on the evidence it heard regarding the ability of the LFB to take control of the lift using the fireman's switch during the fire. The TMO submits that the inquiry heard evidence that it did have in place subcontractors whom it could reasonably have expected to maintain the lifts and their associated switches. Regarding the smoke control system, the inquiry will need to consider how the system performed on the night of the fire. And when doing this, it will need to keep in mind, as has been said, that it was never designed to deal with the quantity or smoke in the Grenfell Tower fire. In this regard, the inquiry heard evidence from Simon Lay, who opined that the system operated as intended and that it's likely it operated beyond its expected parameters, despite the failure of other provisions that it relied on. So regarding Carl Stokes, and briefly, it's submitted that the TMO was entitled to conclude Carl Stokes was a competent fire risk assessor, and despite some parts of his reports, there was nothing about his overall performance that should have caused the TMO to think his services should have been dispensed with altogether. That the TMO was entitled to conclude this was the case was confirmed by Colin Todd, the expert commissioned by the inquiry. He said that Carl Stokes' reports were of a reasonable quality and would not have given those who engaged him to conclude that he was not capable of performing the role. Since the fire at Grenfell Tower, both the Fire Safety Act 2021 and the Fire Safety England Regulations 2022 have been drafted, which now formalise for the first time the role of a fire risk assessor. The Fire Safety Act 2021 amends the Fire Safety Order 2005 to clarify that in buildings with two or more sets of domestic premises, the Fire Safety Order 2005 does apply to the structure and external walls of the building, including cladding, balconies and windows, and to all doors between the domestic premises and the common parts. Prior to the fire, it was certainly the view of many authoritative commentators and practitioners that it did. And again, sir, the TMO says the fact that the government seemed fit to legislate on the topic tends to suggest a previous lack of clarity around it at the very least. Regarding PEEPs, the inquiry heard that the TMO did not have a system for completing PEEPs for disabled residents at Grenfell Tower, and that none was in fact completed. In not completing PEEPs, the TMO is not acting inconsistently with the practice of other organisations in a similar position at the time, and indeed today. And so the TMO refutes the suggestion that it did not care for disabled people. Decisions about which floor disabled people were housed in were not made by the TMO, but by RBKC. Although the TMO was aware of persons with disabilities, it believed that the compartmentation and the stay-put strategy was a sound one. In May 2022, the government announced a proposal that went counter the inquiry. I'll start that again, sir. In May 2022, the government announced proposals that went counter to your recommendations for PEEPs, deeming them impractical and not proportionate. So that fact alone attests to the difficulties, at least, surrounding the issue of PEEPs for disabled people in high-rise buildings. Though the topic was the subject of a government consultation, which recently published the responses it received, it is again now the subject of a further consultation. Despite the inquiry's recommendations, the existence of the current debate demonstrates the complexity around seeking a resolution to the issue. The TMO was certainly not unique in its approach towards PEEPs and social housing, and the difficulties encountered in resolving how disabled people could safely evacuate a high-rise building. I submit that the fact that this remains unresolved should be kept in mind by the inquiry when considering the TMO's conduct prior to the fire regarding PEEPs. So, in conclusion, the TMO recognised that its conduct and the conduct of its staff will be carefully assessed and analysed by the inquiry. Respectfully invites the inquiry to take into account all of the submissions made above and now when analysing its conduct and that of its staff. It is submitted that in general terms, the inquiry would be entitled to conclude that the TMO acted reasonably within the limits of its role as client on this design and build project, and its social housing professional staff acted conscientiously and in good faith. The TMO was, after all, a non-specialist body which was entitled to rely on the expertise of its specialist contractors, particularly when taking advice on the materials to be used. So also the inquiry should not overlook or underplay the wider societal and systemic issues that the TMO has sought to identify in its various submissions. And should we submit, consider the TMO's conduct and performance in the light of these. The TMO also respectfully suggests that the inquiry should not overlook the fact that it has been necessary to introduce substantial legislative changes in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire, partly as a result of the inquiry's own findings to date. So none of these submissions should detract from what was said at the outset, that the TMO supports the aims of this inquiry, and it continues to express its sincere condolence with the bereaved and hopes that the findings, recommendations, and implementation of those recommendations provide the bereaved with some comfort in the years to come. And Sarah, I'm finished there. Can I apologise for going 10 minutes over my allotted time?
Well, I don't think you've gone over too badly, given the fact that we had a bit of a hiccup at the beginning. So thank you very much, Mr. Ageros, and I'm glad we were able to hear you from Birmingham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
The next statement is going to be made by Miss Anne Studd, King's Counsel, on behalf of the Mayor of London. So, Miss Studd, I think the housekeeping's been done, and we're ready to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So can I start by making some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to deal with 7 topics which are featured in the evidence and which the Mayor considers are important considerations for your Phase 2 report. By way of introduction, the Mayor would like to start his final remarks to this inquiry by paying tribute to the bereaved survivors and residents, who, notwithstanding the length of this inquiry and the distressing nature of much of the evidence called before it, have honoured themselves and the deceased by the dignity, the strength, and the composure that they have shown. At the centre of this lengthy inquiry is the tragic loss of life of 72 individuals. Fittingly, the inquiry began with the commemorations in respect of each one of them, and concluded with drawing together the circumstances in which each one died. The preparation of that evidence must have been harrowing in the extreme. Those who mourn a loved one and those bereaved survivors and residents who've suffered so profoundly since the fire on the 14th of June 2017 have ensured that those who died have remained central to this inquiry, notwithstanding the inevitable re-traumatising impact that the whole process must have had on them. Some have attended these proceedings in person, others have attended remotely, but all of them have shown bravery and courage and have sought to ensure that those who died have had their voices heard over the half-decade since the tragedy. The Mayor is aware of how difficult this inquiry has been for them and how difficult their lives will continue to be when this inquiry is over. he knows that the wait for justice has been too long. Now that the evidential hearings have come to an end, the Mayor seeks to explore some overarching themes that have featured in the course of Phase 2, and to highlight topics that are likely to form part of his submission on recommendations. Those recommendations and the implementation of them will be fundamental to ensuring that the Grenfell Tower fire marks a turning point in building safety. Just turning to deal with the recommendations and their implementation. In his terms of reference, you, sir, concluded by saying that you would report your findings to the Prime Minister as soon as possible and would make recommendations. In 2017, in its report, How Public Inquiries Can Lead to Change, the Institute of Government found that of the 68 public inquiries that had taken place since 1990, only 6 had received full scrutiny by a select committee to hold the government to account for what progress had been made regarding those recommendations. It further concluded that there was no firm procedure for holding the government to account for promises made in the aftermath of inquiries. The implementation of recommendations is patchy, and in some cases, repeat incidents have occurred, and there is no system for allowing inquiries to build on the learning of their predecessors. In the course of this inquiry, it has become clear that the lessons of the Lakanal House fire, for example, had not been learned, in spite of the recommendations from the coroner, and that some of those recommendations may have impacted on the tragic events of the 14th of June 2017. Overwhelmingly, the bereaved survivors and residents need to be reassured that this inquiry will make recommendations to prevent future loss of life in similar circumstances. They deserve robust and enforceable recommendations to give them some solace in the knowledge that others will not have to suffer in the way that they have. Thus far, however, action and change at a national level has been conspicuously slow or absent. Notwithstanding your recommendations in your Phase 1 report, the response from government, building developers and owners has fallen woefully short of what the bereaved survivors and residents had every right to expect. While the London Fire Brigade has completed 90% of the recommendations directed at the service in the Phase 1 report, the government has not yet implemented any of the recommendations it is responsible for undertaking, nearly 3 years after they were made. In addition, there remain too many residents in London and across the country living in fear in high-rise buildings that are covered in dangerous, flammable cladding. The Mayor observes also that the designs for buildings are still being submitted with critical safety failings. The unavoidable reality of the evidence through Phase 2 is that it has demonstrated a reluctance by government and industry to learn and instigate change following previous fires. Evidence heard about the response to the Lakanal House inquests showed missed opportunities that failed to prevent a fire such as the one at Grenfell Tower occurring. As the Mayor set out in his closings for Modules 1 and 2, this is an opportunity to make real and substantial change. The inquiry has heard about missed opportunities in the past, and this inquiry was not be consigned to history as another one. Across the industry as a whole, there has to be a culture of safety and accountability. In construction, the safety of the building and its residents and visitors must be paramount, and risk ownership must remain the responsibility of every organisation involved with a project. As you heard in the course of Phase 2, Module 6.1, prior to the refurbishment at Grenfell Tower, the BRE had testing data demonstrating that materials that were known to be compostable were being used on high-rise buildings. There had been additional warnings from industry to government that the regulations were not clear, were subject to differing interpretation, and were compromising safety. Yet nothing was done to effectively act upon those concerns or to heed the warnings. The failure to act on this information was a further missed opportunity to prevent this fire. As the Mayor highlighted in a letter to the then Prime Minister in June 2022, what is the point of inquests and inquiries if the recommendations and learning that evolves from them is simply going to be ignored? The inquiry should be concerned about the slow response of government to the recommendations made in the Phase 1 report and troubled by its rejection of the recommendation that would require owners of high-rise flats to prepare PEEPs evacuation plans for disabled residents. As the inquiry is aware, 41% of those who died in the fire were disabled, and not one had a PEEP. The fact that those affected have felt compelled to seek redress through the courts is a matter of the utmost concern. The independent charity inquest has for 15 years been calling for the establishment of a national oversight mechanism, an arm's-length public body with a duty to collate, analyse and monitor recommendations arising from post-death investigations and their implementation. The Mayor reiterates his support for the establishment of such a body. It is essential that the Grenfell Tower inquiry recommendations are neither ignored nor rejected without careful rationale. The Mayor would invite the inquiry to recommend to the Prime Minister as part of his report that at the very least a body or system is set up to monitor the progress of the recommendations from this inquiry, reporting annually to Parliament, perhaps symbolically on the 14th of June, the progress made on the recommendations and updates about their work on fire and building safety overall. This should be followed by a parliamentary debate on the report. I turn now to deal with the 7 topics. In addition to the issue of recommendations and their implementation, the Mayor considers that there have been overarching themes that have crossed modules and upon which your report should make consideration. First of all, the institutional indifference to residents of Grenfell Tower and the surrounding buildings. Secondly, discrimination. Thirdly, the lack of professional training, competence and skills within the professions. Fourthly, the issue of profit before safety. Fifthly, deregulation, austerity and cuts. Sixth, the absence of rigour, independence and transparency in testing and certification. And 7, the lack of accountability. I turn first to deal with institutional indifference to the residents. In modules 3 and 4 particularly, the inquiry heard evidence of the treatment of the residents of Grenfell Tower and its surrounding blocks, both during the refurbishment of the building and in the aftermath of the fire. The attitude of RBKC and the TMO made residents feel like second-class citizens, a nuisance, troublemakers, who should take what they were given and be grateful. This was wholly unacceptable. Rather than any appreciation that residents wanted to feel safe in their homes, there was a total indifference to their needs. It was the TMO's job to have regard to those needs and concerns. As Mr. Defan wrote in his statement, I never believed that the TMO was capable of keeping residents safe. The underlying reasons for this lie in the culture of governance that prevailed, and because the personnel held prejudiced views about how residents should behave, essentially to be thankful for their services or effectively be damned. Their dealing with me were institutionally biased and in many instances animated by individual prejudice. In their eyes, I was stigmatised as a troublemaker. Having heard the evidence from the bereaved survivors and residents in modules 3 and 4, the attitude so eloquently described by Mr. Defan was clearly not confined to him, nor to those in the Grenfell Action Group, or to the small minority of perceived troublemakers identified by the witnesses from Ryden and the TMO in the course of their evidence. The inquiry has heard evidence on multiple occasions that the tenants were treated as second-class citizens, with the concerns that they raised being ignored or dismissed, while the focus fell on the, and I quote, rebel residents and troublemakers, and how to undermine rather than resolve their concerns. Driven as they were to publicly record what was happening by setting up the Grenfell Action Group blog, they were threatened then with libel proceedings by the TMO, and the blog was blocked so the staff were unable to view the residents' complaints. It is against that background that failures in provision of support in the aftermath of the fire have to be viewed. Once again, the focus was not on the needs and concerns of those displaced, but on preventing public disorder, on policing, and on avoiding protest, making the bereaved survivors and residents feel criminalised, wholly unsupported, and alone. The Phase 2 report needs to record in stark terms the experience of these residents. They are unfortunately not alone. The culture of complaints by social housing tenants being dismissed, ignored, and repairs not acted upon for months, unfortunately, seems to be commonly reported. I turn to deal with discrimination. In answer to those who invited the chairman to expand his terms of reference to consider whether factors such as social background and race played a significant role in the Grenfell Tower fire, the inquiry issued a public statement making it clear, and I quote, that although the chairman shared the concerns of those who felt these were important questions which required urgent examination, on careful reflection, he came to the conclusion, when recommending the inquiry's terms of reference, that the inquiry was not the best way to answer them. However, if in the course of its investigation the panel finds that factors of that kind played a part in any of the decisions under consideration, it will make that clear in its report. Now, at the conclusion of the evidence, it is important that the inquiry makes good that reassurance. As others have made clear previously, discrimination is the elephant in the room. As demonstrated in the relationship between RBKC, the TMO and the tenants, both before and after the fire, issues of institutionalised discrimination have arisen in so many different ways that they certainly warrant inclusion in your Phase 2 report. I turn to just look at a few examples. The inquiry heard evidence that disabled residents were housed on highest floors without any discussion or plans about what to do in an emergency. Government guidance written by Colin Todd advised that PEEPs were not needed in general residential housing, and yet 41% of those who perished were disabled. Disabled residents' needs were not given adequate consideration when it came to emergency rehousing after the fire, and you heard painful evidence from survivors in relation to the effect of those failures. Sir, disabled residents have been marginalised and treated as though their lives are inferior. The government's rejection of the Phase 1 recommendation regarding PEEPs only adds to that sense of marginalisation. The Mayor endorses the emphatic plea from the BSRs outlined by Mr. Freedman on Monday that this inquiry must leave the government in no doubt that their current intransigent position is wholly unacceptable in the light of the evidence heard here, and that an urgent interim report on this issue is essential in order to immediately address the increased risk to disabled residents seeking to evacuate in the event of a fire. The evidence also supports the concern that race played a part in the issues under consideration and warrants inclusion in your inquiry report. The inquiry is aware that a significant proportion of the bereaved survivors and residents in this case, and the deceased, were Black, Asian or minority ethnic. The weight of the evidence called before the inquiry reveals discrimination at an elementary and obvious level so as to warrant inclusion. For example, not considering that information in relation to the refurbishment was available in other languages for those with limited English. Fire safety information only being provided in the building in English. Additionally, the inquiry heard in Module 3 that the manipulation of the complaint system, disgraceful as it was on its own, also discriminated against those who were unable to confidently register a written complaint in English. The discrimination that had existed before the fire translated to the response after the fire. Compare and contrast the total lack of consideration of protected characteristics and cultural requirements from RBKC and the TMO in relation to unsuitable meal provision and accommodation, with the altogether opposite approach of Mr. Mark Sims and his volunteers from the Rugby Portobello Trust, who assisted in organising a street iftar so people could break fast and pray together in their most difficult times. The state authorities appeared to be more concerned with policing those who'd been displaced in order to prevent a perceived risk of public disorder, rather than ensuring a safe place, accommodating their needs, and providing as much comfort as could be afforded to them in those desperate hours. The evidence is so glaring and obvious, and the failures so elementary, that it is clearly an issue on which the inquiry should now be considering including in its report, in order to fulfil that undertaking that you, Mr. Chairman, gave so long ago. I turn to deal with lack of professional training, competence and skills. The evidence in Phase 2 has displayed an alarming lack of training, competence and skills in the professional industries that were engaged with the Grenfell Tower refurbishment. Just by way of example, as they are too numerous to list, Studio E were underqualified to perform the tasks which they had been contracted to perform and were aware that a proper procurement process would have illustrated their lack of experience. Exover's existing fire safety strategy was wholly inadequate for any relevant purpose for which it was required. And Carl Stokes, who in April 2016 fire risk assessment wrote that new external cladding has been fitted to this building, approved and accepted the fixing system and cladding used, when he had not even seen any building control documentation or any other independent information. His opinion was based on an informal conversation with a representative from Ryden and a conversation he had with TMO. Barbara Lane described it as professionally reckless. Overlaid on that professional reckless, the inquiry has heard about a cladding industry that relied upon aggressive marketing and was not cowed by the catastrophic testing conducted by the BRE, but was, on the contrary, prepared to manipulate the testing, ensuring it was over-engineered to achieve a pass. Serious consideration must be given to how this can be rectified by the introduction of clear professional standards, mandatory requirements of knowledge and expertise, and ongoing compulsory training. The current skills shortage across industry, which affects also the London Fire Brigade as well as other organisations, is a cause for real concern and must be addressed. Failure to do so undermines any positive changes introduced through the Building Safety Act and the Fire Safety Act. Profits before safety. As the Mayor indicated in his closings to Modules 1 and 2 of Phase 2, in the course of the refurbishment of the Grenfell Tower, there appears to have been a primary focus on profit from the contractors and on low cost from the TMO, rather than any accountability or concern for risk and safety to the residents. None of the basic checks for fire performance were carried out by the design team, nor picked up by any other organisation, including the TMO. The evidence at the inquiry revealed a total absence of risk ownership by those who should have been expected to have the safety of residents at the heart of the refurbishment. The evidence has pointed to a culture in the construction industry in which profits are pursued at the expense of public safety. There are again many examples of this, including a willingness of Ryden to pocket a substantial part of the £200,000 saving by using ACM cladding, notwithstanding the greater fire risk. Additionally, the aggressive marketing adopted by the manufacturers seeking to conceal or manipulate testing to achieve better sales. On top of that, they then threatened organisations who questioned them with legal action. And while loved ones were desperately searching for news of their relatives, they attempted to lobby government to protect their own commercial interests. The inquiry report needs to set out clearly, sir, the unconscionable behaviour of the industry, illustrating the race for profit with a corresponding disregard for public safety that appears to have become embedded in this broken system. Deregulation, austerity and cuts. In the later part of Phase 2, the inquiry heard evidence about the barriers that deregulation placed on the ability of departments to amend regulations which had a public safety impact. Anthony Bird, a civil servant in the then DCLG, told you that the drive to deregulate resulted in spending an inordinate amount of time looking at how we could deregulate. While Brian Martin said ministers were very focused on avoiding anything that might impact on the economy in a negative way. This clearly had an impact on the review of the ABD and the ability to action any significant change in the aftermath of Lakanal House. In addition, and undoubtedly, the policy of austerity has contributed to a culture in which some state employees see their role to act as gatekeepers for the meagre service provision available, rather than as public servants whose role it is to act in the public interest. In line with the 7 principles of public life, state employees should act solely in terms of the public interest and must act and take decisions impartially, fairly and on merit, using the best evidence and without discrimination or bias. The inquiry has heard considerable evidence to illustrate that those principles were not being acted upon by RBKC and the TMO in the course of this refurbishment or in the aftermath of the fire. The deregulation agenda, coupled with austerity and cuts to public services, was a dangerous combination. The inquiry heard evidence that between 2013 and 2017, the RBKC Building Control Department had lost 10 surveyors who had 230 years' experience between them and were replaced by 1 graduate. Mr. Hoban, when he gave evidence before you, demonstrated the toll that this had had on his ability to do the job he wanted to be able to do. The consequences of what appears to have been a gross lack of resources were catastrophic. The LFB too had faced budget cuts and the consequential reduction of resources between 2009 and 2016. The inquiry must look at these issues in the round. These are significant matters which had a causal effect on public officers not being able to properly fulfil their duties in relation to the preservation of public safety. Proper regulation is needed, it must be secured and not left as an option. The absence of rigour, independence and transparency from testing, regulators and certifiers. Perhaps of all the evidence in Module 2 in relation to testing was the most shocking. It must have been deeply traumatising for the bereaved survivors and residents. The lack of rigour and transparency in testing allowed the manufacturers to keep the evidence in relation to combustibility confidential, even when they themselves were aware of the danger it posed. An ethical industry would have put safety first, but they did not. Profit took precedence, and obtaining the market share was pivotal, notwithstanding what the industry already knew, that this product should not be used to clad high-rise buildings. There was an obvious issue. The BRE were being paid large amounts of money to test products from other private companies. They were a significant source of revenue. There was evidence that the relationship was not as intrusive as the public might expect from an independent testing regime. BRE erroneously trusted the honesty of their clients. The privatisation and poor governance procedures led to companies being able to manipulate testing by setting up test rigs and adding items without the BRE staff knowing. The complete absence of any transparency of test results allowed Arconic to hide its products' failed tests. The evidence showed that the system of testing was capable of being and was rigged, resulting in certificates that were worthless. Those certificates were relied upon by organisations like the Local Authority Building Control and the National Health Building Council, even when they were suspicious of the results. The BBA relied heavily on information from the very companies who wanted certification for their products. There was a lack of intrusiveness by the testing authorities and a misplaced trust that companies who were only interested in profit would voluntarily inform certifiers of failed test results or inaccurate information on certificates. The public deserve to know that products being used on their homes have been effectively and robustly tested and certified safe. Objectivity and high standards are paramount. And lastly, I want to deal with the lack of accountability. To any observer, this has indeed been a merry-go-round of buck passing. The commercial bodies have taken no responsibility and shown little, if any, contrition for their role in the loss of 72 lives. Not one single organisation or commercial body seems to be able to take responsibility for its own omissions in the context of the catastrophe as a whole, preferring to move the blame up or down the line, but in any event, away from their door. The only reasonable conclusion that can be reached by this inquiry is that this is an industry that will not change its culture voluntarily. You will recall Paul Hyatt giving evidence before you when he said, "Our entire industry and all the professions within it, and my own included." I think there has to be a lot of very careful contemplation from here on. Unfortunately, from what the inquiry has heard in the course of evidence since he gave that evidence on day 65, this industry, as represented in this inquiry, has not shown itself capable of such reflection. As the Mayor highlighted in his closing to Modules 1 and 2, the architect relied upon the safety engineer relied upon the cladding contractor relied upon the manufacturer, who had a commercial interest in remaining silent, and they all relied upon the final arbiter of building control for compliance, without taking any responsibility for it themselves, and without providing the information that was necessary for any accurate assessment to be made. No one asked intrusive questions, no one offered information that they knew might be relevant to the safety of those living in the tower. As Dr. Lane said to you, fire safety engineering is about protecting people. When you forget that, you get caught up in the game of making things work and getting things through, and you forget about your primary responsibility, which is protecting people. In the refurbishment of the tower, it is hard to see that any organisation focused on protecting people at any stage. As the inquiry will be aware, within that appalling shifting of blame, the cladding manufacturer blamed the insulation for the fire spread, while the insulation manufacturer blamed the cladding. Both distanced themselves from the decision made to use their product on Grenfell Tower, but were content to market and sell their combustible products widely and without caveat. The lack of accountability, responsibility, candour and transparency from these organisations is shameful. The inquiry has one opportunity left through its Phase 2 report to make findings that give the bereaved, survivors and residents the accountability they deserve and are entitled to, albeit at this very late stage after the fire, and recommendations to prevent anything like it from ever happening again. No one else must endure what they have had to endure for so long.
Thank you very much, Ms. Studd. Well, that completes the statements that we were expecting to hear this afternoon, but we shall be resuming tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, when we shall hear further closing statements from core participants, followed by a closing statement from counsel to the inquiry. As I say, we'll do that at 10 o'clock tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.